Have you ever found yourself in a moment where everything you knew was turned upside down? What if someone you trusted completely, someone close to you, made you question everything? What happens when you almost cross a line, and everything you thought was solid suddenly feels fragile? The quiet moments in life can sometimes be the most telling. When you're alone, with nothing but your thoughts, you might think you know yourself inside and out. But what happens when someone unexpected stirs feelings you didn't know were there? For Sofia, the days when her husband, Alex, was away on business trips used to be a peaceful escape. But little did she know that one simple visit from his best friend, Daniel, would change everything. It all started so innocently. Sofia had gotten used to the quiet solitude when Alex, her husband, went away on business trips. She loved the calmness that would settle over their home. In his absence, the stillness of the house, the freedom to enjoy some peace and quiet. It was her time to recharge, read her books, and simply enjoy her own company without the demands of everyday life. But this time was different. She hadn't expected Daniel, Alex's best friend, to stop by so unexpectedly. It was the kind of visit that seemed normal on the surface. Daniel was a good friend of Alex's, someone Sofia had known for years. He'd come over a few times before, usually to catch up with Alex, but never when Alex was away. Sofia felt no reason to think anything would be different. At first, the conversation was light. They spoke about small things, the weather, the news, the trivial details of their everyday lives. But as the evening wore on, there was an unspoken shift in the air, a subtle change that Sofia couldn't quite place, but definitely felt. Daniel's presence in the room began to feel more intense, and Sofia couldn't ignore the way his attention seemed to linger on her in a way it never had before. Sofia had always seen Daniel as just a friend, someone who was a part of their shared life, someone Alex trusted like a brother. But now, sitting across from him, she noticed things she hadn't before. The way his gaze softened when it met hers, the way his laugh was a little warmer, his jokes a little more personal. There was an energy between them now that wasn't there before, an electric current that neither of them had asked for, but neither could deny. At one point, Daniel made a lighthearted comment about how Alex would be missing out by not being there, and for a brief moment their eyes locked. There was a brief pause, a moment of silence before either of them spoke again. It was as if the words were unsaid, but both of them knew that the air had shifted. A moment of undeniable attraction had surfaced, unspoken but undeniable. Sofia felt her heart race a little faster. It was a strange sensation, one she wasn't sure how to deal with. She had always loved Alex, always trusted him with every part of herself. But sitting there with Daniel, something felt different. The warmth of his presence felt comforting, and his attentiveness felt like a balm to a part of her that hadn't been touched in a long time. But then, as quickly as the tension arose, a wave of guilt washed over her. She didn't want to go down this road. She didn't want to betray Alex, not even in thought. She loved him. He was her husband, her partner in every sense of the word. The last thing she wanted to do was entertain feelings that could break everything they had built together. Yet, as she tried to push the thought away, she found herself becoming more and more aware of the way Daniel was looking at her. He wasn't just friendly. There was something deeper there, something that made Sofia question everything. Was it just her imagination, or was there something more? Daniel, for his part, seemed aware of the sudden shift as well. He wasn't being overly forward, but his body language had changed. He leaned in a little closer when he spoke, his voice a little softer, his hand brushing against hers just a little too often. Sofia couldn't help but notice. She couldn't help but feel the pull between them, despite her every effort to push it aside. She had always prided herself on her loyalty to Alex, but now she was caught in a web of emotions she didn't know how to untangle. Every fiber of her being screamed that this wasn't right, but another part of her, one she couldn't quite control, wanted to see where this could go. She wanted to feel the excitement, the rush, the warmth of being seen in a way. But then, as the weight of the situation settled on her chest, Sofia knew she had to make a choice. She couldn't go any further down this path. She couldn't let this attraction spiral into something dangerous. "We can't do this," she said, her voice soft but firm, the words tasting like a silent plea for everything to stop. Daniel didn't push back. Instead, he nodded slowly, his face a mix of regret and understanding. "You're right," he said quietly. "We can't." But despite the words, neither of them felt relief. The tension didn't simply disappear, it hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable, as both of them tried to move past the moment. But the damage had been done. Sophia realized that even though nothing physical had happened, the emotional impact of what they had almost done would change everything. That night, as she lay in bed, Sophia couldn't escape the feeling that something inside her had shifted. She couldn't forget the connection she'd felt with Daniel, and she couldn't shake the guilt that now lingered in her heart. The tension wasn't just in the room anymore, it was inside her, knotting her thoughts and emotions. And the worst part? She wasn't sure how to let it go. The next few days felt like a blur for Sophia. She went through the motions of her routine, trying to shake off the tension from that night with Daniel. She focused on work, spent time with her friends, and tried to do everything she could to distract herself. But the more she tried to forget, the more her mind kept drifting back to him. At first, she thought it would be easy to push the encounter aside. After all, nothing had happened. No words were said that crossed any boundaries. But the truth was, the feeling lingered. The connection she felt with Daniel wasn't something she could just ignore. The thought of him kept creeping into her mind. His laugh, the way his eyes would soften when he looked at her, the way he listened to her as though every word mattered. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper. Something that felt both thrilling and terrifying at the same time. Sophia had always felt secure in her relationship with Alex. Their love was stable, calm and comforting, but in that one moment with Daniel, she had felt something different, something she hadn't realized she was missing. As much as she tried to bury it, the spark she felt with Daniel didn't fade. Every time she was alone, she would replay the way things had unfolded that night. The subtle tension, the words left unsaid, the way her heart had skipped a beat when their hands brushed. The guilt followed her everywhere. It was a constant shadow, lurking in her thoughts, whispering that she had come too close to crossing a line. But there was also this sense of longing, a quiet desire that she couldn't quite shake. Sophia was no stranger to self-doubt, but this was different. She couldn't help but wonder if what she'd felt with Daniel was a sign of something she had been missing in her marriage. Not that Alex wasn't enough. He was everything she had ever wanted. But there was a part of her that had always craved excitement, passion, the kind of spark that made her feel truly alive. And in Daniel's presence, she felt that spark. She couldn't help comparing the two men, her husband, Alex, and Daniel. Alex was steady, reliable, the kind of person who had always been there for her. Their relationship was grounded in mutual respect, shared memories, and a deep connection. But with Daniel, there was something raw, something electric. Every glance felt charged, every word seemed layered with meaning. It was an attraction that was both forbidden and exhilarating, and it left Sophia feeling like she was walking on a tightrope. She kept telling herself that it was just a moment of weakness, just an isolated incident, that she loved Alex and this attraction to Daniel was nothing more than a fleeting feeling. But deep down, Sophia knew it wasn't that simple. She had never felt like this before. Not with Alex, not with anyone. The connection with Daniel was something she couldn't explain, and it was something she couldn't easily forget. But there was still a part of her that tried to brush it off. She had made a choice, hadn't she? They had both agreed to stop. Nothing had happened, and they had moved on. She had promised herself she would put it behind her. But how could she? How could she just pretend like the intimacy they had shared, even if only emotionally, didn't matter? In an attempt to regain her sense of normalcy, Sophia reached out to Alex more frequently, filling the quiet moments with phone calls, texts, and video chats. She told herself it was because she missed him. She did, of course, but she couldn't ignore the underlying truth. Every time they spoke, she compared his calm demeanor to Daniel's energy. Alex was dependable, grounded, but Daniel had been like a spark in the dark, something that made her feel like there was more to life than just going through the motions. When Alex finally came home from his business trip, things were calm on the surface. They fell back into their usual routine, dinners, small talk, the comfortable rhythm of their everyday life. But Sophia felt something had shifted. There was a space between them now, one that hadn't been there before. It wasn't that Alex had done anything wrong. It was just that Sophia was aware of the difference between the life she had with him and the connection she had with Daniel. Even if that connection had never been fully realized, Sophia started questioning everything. What was she missing in her marriage? Was it that excitement, that thrill of something new? Was that what she had felt with Daniel? Or was it something else entirely? The confusion gnawed at her, keeping her up at night as she stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment in her head. The emotional connection with Daniel had been so intense, so undeniable, that it felt like it had marked her in a way she couldn't explain. The look they had shared, the moments when their eyes met and they both knew that something had passed between them. Something unspoken, something dangerous. It was a fleeting moment, but Sofia couldn't forget it, even though they hadn't crossed any physical boundaries. The emotional tension had been enough. It left her with a hunger she didn't know how to satisfy, a void that she couldn't fill just by being with Alex. She loved him, of course, but there was a part of her that wondered if something was missing. She tried to focus on her marriage, tried to push the thoughts of Daniel out of her mind, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't forget the way she had felt that night. The pull toward him, the intensity of that moment. She couldn't forget the way his presence had made her feel seen, heard, and important in a way that, at times, she didn't feel in her relationship with Alex. And that was the problem. The connection with Daniel was just a memory now, something that Sofia couldn't act on. But the emotional impact of that night, the feelings that had surfaced, were still there. They were lingering beneath the surface, making her question the stability of her marriage and the choices she had made. What was she really longing for? Was it just the excitement of an affair or the deeper emotional connection that she had started to feel with Daniel? Every time Sofia thought she had moved on, every time she told herself that it was just a fleeting moment, the emotions would resurface. And the tension, the pull between her and Daniel, seemed to haunt her, even though she knew nothing more would come of it. It had been a week since Alex had returned home, but Sofia still couldn't shake the strange sense of unease that had settled over her. It wasn't that Alex had done anything wrong. He had, as always, been kind, attentive, and loving. Yet something within Sofia felt different. She felt distant, like she was living in two separate worlds. The life she had with Alex was comfortable, but the life she had shared, even momentarily with Daniel, lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just the moments they had spent together that were haunting her. It was the unspoken words, the emotions that had passed between them in silence. It felt like the what-ifs had taken root inside her, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore them, they kept growing. One evening after dinner, Sofia found herself sitting in the living room, staring out the window, lost in thought. Alex had excused himself to finish some work for the next day, leaving Sofia with her thoughts. It had become a familiar routine. Her mind would wander back to Daniel, to that night, to that spark. But this time, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads, and she had to make a decision. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from Daniel. "Hey, are you free to talk?" Sofia's heart skipped a beat. The message was innocent enough, just a casual check-in, but the timing felt almost too perfect. She hadn't heard from him in days, and part of her had convinced herself that the awkwardness between them had faded. Yet here he was reaching out again. Without thinking, her fingers moved to unlock the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She was tempted to respond, to initiate a conversation. But then, a voice inside her, the voice of reason, reminded her why this was dangerous. She had promised herself, she had promised Alex that nothing would happen. She had tried to move on, tried to bury what had transpired between her and Daniel, yet the feelings remained, always just under the surface. Sofia put her phone down with a sigh, her mind racing. She stood up, pacing around the room, trying to quiet the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. What was she supposed to do? Was she overthinking everything? Was it just a harmless moment of attraction that she was blowing out of proportion? Or was there something deeper at play, something she couldn't deny? Minutes passed, and Sofia's emotions began to spiral. She didn't want to hurt Alex. Not in any way, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore how she felt. The connection with Daniel had been real, and it had been something she had allowed to happen, something she had participated in. It wasn't just a fantasy. It had been a glimpse of something real, something that had stirred something deep inside her. And now, she was standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Sofia froze, her heart racing. She wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, she considered pretending she wasn't home, hiding from whatever this moment was about to bring. But instead, she took a deep breath and walked toward the door. When she opened it, standing in front of her was Daniel. His expression was one of hesitation, his eyes searching hers as if he were trying to gauge her reaction. There was a slight nervousness in his posture, but his presence was still commanding. Sofia's heart thudded in her chest. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "Sofia," Daniel said, his voice quieter than usual. "I need to talk to you." She didn't know why, but the words felt like a weight, like the moment had finally arrived. The moment where everything they had been dancing around would come to light, for better or for worse. Okay, she whispered, stepping aside to let him in. As soon as he walked through the door, the space between them seemed to shrink. There was no distance anymore, not emotionally at least. Their eyes locked, and for a second, everything else faded. All the questions, all the guilt, all the confusion vanished, leaving only the undeniable tension. It was as if the world outside their little bubble didn't exist. In this moment, it was just them, standing at the precipice of something neither of them was sure they were ready for. Sofia's breath caught in her throat. "What is it, Daniel? What do we do now?" His expression softened, and for a second, Sofia could see the vulnerability that had been hidden beneath the surface. "I don't know," he admitted, taking a step closer. I can't stop thinking about what happened, about how we felt." The words hung in the air like a confession. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was acknowledging what had passed between them. And in doing so, he made it real. He made the emotions that had been simmering between them undeniable. Sofia's heart raced. "But you know we can't..." She trailed off, her voice shaky. She couldn't finish the sentence. They both knew what she was going to say. "I'm married, Daniel." "I know," he replied, his voice low, almost as if he were afraid to speak too loudly, as if the words would make everything irreversible. "But that night when we were together, when we almost crossed the line, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About you. About us." Sofia's chest tightened as the emotion swelled inside her. There was a part of her that wanted to pull away, to tell him this couldn't go any further, but another part of her, a part she had kept hidden, wanted to lean in. She wanted to feel that spark again, to explore what had been ignited between them. The room was silent, and Sofia could hear the pounding of her own heart in her ears. The tension between them was palpable, and every inch of her being screamed at her to make a decision. But the fear, the guilt, the weight of her commitment to Alex held her back. "I can't do this," Sofia whispered, stepping back, the distance between them growing as she found her voice again. "I can't betray him. I can't betray us." Daniel stood there, his face a mixture of disappointment and understanding, but he didn't push her. He simply nodded, acknowledging her choice. "I get it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you. Sofia, I never meant for things to get this complicated." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was thick with emotions neither of them knew how to sort through. And as Daniel turned to leave, Sofia felt a pang of loss. Not because she wanted to be with him, but because she knew that part of her would never forget what had almost happened. What had almost been. As he stepped out of the door, Sofia stood frozen, her mind spinning. The door clicked shut, but the emotional door they had almost opened remained wide. She was left standing there, knowing she had made the right decision, but feeling an ache deep inside. It wasn't about what had happened with Daniel, it was about what she had learned about herself, what she had discovered about her own desires, her own needs, and the parts of her marriage with Alex that she had never fully confronted before. The days that followed Daniel's visit were heavy with reflection. Sofia knew she had made the right choice, but it didn't make the emotional weight of the situation any lighter. Every glance she exchanged with Alex felt tinged with something unspoken, something she couldn't quite define. It wasn't that she no longer loved him, because she did. She loved him deeply, with a kind of love that had built itself over years of shared experiences. But her heart now held a new awareness, a truth she could no longer ignore. Sofia found herself retreating into herself, spending long moments alone, mulling over everything that had happened. The encounter with Daniel had forced her to look inward in a way she hadn't before. It wasn't just about the attraction she felt for him, though that was certainly part of it. It was the realization that, despite the stability and comfort of her marriage, there were parts of herself that had remained unexplored, parts of her that had been buried under the routine of everyday life. With Daniel, she had briefly tasted something more intense, something wild, and the absence of that energy was now palpable. But despite the longing she still felt, despite the part of her that wanted to explore the emotional connection with Daniel, Sofia understood that life wasn't about the fleeting sparks of passion. It wasn't about the brief moments of excitement that threatened to disrupt everything she had built. It was about the quiet, everyday love that Alex had given her, the steady commitment they had made to one another. The more she thought about it, the more Sofia came to realize that the problem wasn't Alex. It wasn't even Daniel. The problem was her. It was the dissatisfaction that she had allowed to fester within herself, without ever addressing it or communicating it to Alex. She had been so caught up in the idea of something different, something exciting, that she had failed to appreciate. what was already in front of her. She loved Alex, but she had never fully opened up to him about the restlessness she sometimes felt, the desire for adventure, for novelty, for excitement. In her mind, she had always assumed that those things were just a part of life that one had to suppress when you were in a committed relationship. But now, after everything that had happened with Daniel, Sofia realized that she had to be honest with herself, and more importantly, with Alex. She couldn't ignore her own needs anymore. It wasn't about finding another person to fill the gaps. No, it was about understanding what was missing within herself, and how she could share that with her husband. The guilt, the shame, the fear of betraying Alex had finally settled. It didn't disappear entirely, but it had given way to a greater understanding of herself. She had come close to crossing a line, and even though she had stepped back, the experience had sparked something inside her that was impossible to ignore. But now, with a clearer perspective, she knew that she didn't need to sacrifice everything for a fleeting moment of excitement. What she needed was to be open, honest, and vulnerable with Alex in ways she had never been before. So, when Alex returned home after a long day of work, Sofia decided it was time to speak up. She wasn't sure how he would react, but she had to try. She had to tell him about the restlessness she had felt, the loneliness that had sometimes crept into their relationship, the moments when she felt disconnected from everything, including herself. She sat down with him that evening, her heart racing as she finally opened up. The conversation was difficult at first. There were pauses, moments of awkward silence, but they pushed through. Sofia explained everything, the feelings she'd been struggling with, how Daniel had made her question things, and how the experience had forced her to confront parts of herself that she hadn't been able to express. It wasn't easy, but as she spoke, Sofia realized something. This was what had been missing all along: the ability to be vulnerable, to share the deepest parts of herself with the person who mattered most. Alex listened, his face a mix of confusion, hurt, and understanding. He didn't speak much at first, but Sofia could see the wheels turning in his head. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet, but they were filled with emotion. "I didn't know you felt that way," he said softly, "but I'm glad you told me. We've always been good at talking about the surface things, but maybe we haven't gone deep enough. Maybe I haven't been there in the way you needed me to be." His words were a revelation to Sofia. Alex wasn't perfect. He had his own flaws, his own issues. But in that moment, she realized that they had both been guilty of not fully exploring their relationship, of not making space for the deeper conversations that could have brought them closer. They were both just going through the motions, expecting things to stay the same without acknowledging that they, too, were evolving. That night, they talked for hours. About everything. About their relationship, their needs, their fears, and their desires. Sofia didn't know if it was going to be easy from here on out, but she knew that things had shifted. They were finally being real with each other in a way they never had before. In the weeks that followed, Sofia and Alex worked on rebuilding the connection that had begun to fade. It wasn't a quick fix. It was something that required patience, trust, and understanding. But with each conversation, they grew stronger, more attuned to one another's needs. Sofia still felt the echoes of the moment with Daniel, but they no longer held the same power over her. The desire for something more had been replaced with a renewed appreciation for what she already had. As for Daniel, Sofia knew that their paths had crossed at a time when she was vulnerable, seeking something she hadn't fully understood. He was still in her life, but the emotional connection had shifted. She no longer looked at him with the same longing she once had. She had chosen to move forward, to make her marriage a priority. And in doing so, she had learned more about herself than she ever could have imagined. And that's it for today's story. I hope it gave you something to think about, how delicate relationships can be, and how sometimes the choices we make can change everything. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this. Your support means a lot, and I can't wait to bring you more emotional, thought-provoking content. Until next time!